right, well, hi again. First of all, I want to thank Jim Reed and Michael Ruggieri for the invitation to be here with you tonight, and to Jim especially for the nice introduction. Serpent Mound is probably the world's most famous indigenous American Indian mound, and for very good reasons. It's a National Historic Landmark, and as Jim already noted, it's on the United States Department of the Interior's tentative list of sites to be considered for nomination to the UNESCO World Heritage List. And just more practically, more immediately, it's one of the most richly evocative works of landscape art ever created by North America's indigenous people, or anybody else for that matter. So it's been a privilege to study the mound, and I'm honored by the invitation to be here tonight to speak to you about what I think I've learned about it. So this slide is just to remind you that the research that I'm going to be talking about, it's just me here talking, but it's based on the work of a tremendous team over a couple of decades. So I'm standing, on the shoulders or standing next to a lot of really tremendous archaeologists and interested folks who have contributed to this work. Here's a wonderful aerial image taken by a local photographer here named Tim Black. It's beautiful. It shows the landscape in which the Serpent Mound is embedded. Ohio Brush Creek right there. The Serpent Mound is on this peninsula which juts out overlooking the Ohio Brush Creek. It's the largest snake effigy in the ancient world, and it's one of the largest effigy mounds in general. If you unwind it, pulled it straight, it would be 1,500 feet long, and it's about 5 feet high at its highest point, although that's due to restorations, but that's what the original surveyors documented, that it was about 5 foot high originally, and it's been restored to that height. It's located in southern Ohio in what's called Adams County. The map shows you where it is, and the picture there shows you what it looks like sort of if you're standing on the ground. This map here is the earliest map that was done for the mound, and it's the most widely recognized depiction of Serpent Mound. It's historically significant because it appeared in the very first publication of the Smithsonian Institution, but it's not perfectly accurate. There's all kinds of problems with it. One of the things we're trying to tease out with our data is just how many errors there are in the map. It's unquestionable that there are errors, but how extensive are those? This is one indication of how extensive the errors might be. This is an alternative depiction of Serpent Mound done by John McLean in 1884. It was published in the next year, 1885. But it shows more going on with the head than Squire and Davis showed. Squire and Davis interpreted the mound as a serpent with an egg in its mouth. And so from their perspective, that stuff going on beyond the oval, beyond the so-called egg, were confusing and sort of undermined their interpretation that it was a serpent with an egg in its mouth. But McLean surveyed the map before it was restored. So, he saw it in when it was still in very good shape, reasonably. And several other archaeologists mapped that feature too, maybe only in slightly different ways, that sort of horseshoe-shaped feature. But one problem with McLean's map, and the reason why I think it's been neglected, is he offered with it an interpretation that he thought that thing on the other side of the oval was a frog. And he thought that this was actually a depiction of a sort of a story, an Aesop's fable or something, with the serpent striking at this frog, and the frog in her terror and excitement was leaping away and then squirted out this giant egg, which never would have fit in her body anyway. I know when I first read that years and years ago in grad school, I thought that was a ridiculous interpretation. It didn't make any sense. And so I was more inclined to accept the Squire and Davis map as being perhaps more authoritative. But I don't think that's true now. I think this map deserves another look, partially because it's corroborated by the work of other surveyors and other archaeologists, but also partly because no one at the time sort of had any idea what that might represent, and it didn't make sense. But I think I know what it represents now, and it makes perfect sense. So, but that's sort of, I'm alluding to what's to come here. So Frederick Ward Putnam, one of the fathers of American archaeology, investigated Serpent Mound between 1883 and 1889. This is a map from his publication in the Century magazine. He never really wrote up a final report. He just wrote up this popular article for Century magazine. So it's almost all we have to go on. But it shows the serpent, of course, but it shows it in the context of a much broader landscape that offers clues to who might have built the mound. What else is going on in that landscape? I don't know if you can see my arrow there, but there's a large burial mound there. We'll talk about that in a second. There's another smaller mound in this area. And there's another mound over here on the other side of the park road. And then this busy area here with all these numbers was an extensive habitation area. And we'll get into some of the details about those. So primarily 2 cultures were involved in the intensive occupation of that bluff: the Adena culture, what we now call the Adena culture, and the Fort Ancient culture. Unfortunately, Putnam found no artifacts in the Serpent. This is a cross-section of his excavation through the oval. And he also excavated trenches across the Serpent at various points. But he found no artifacts that would associate the construction of the Serpent with either of those or even some other culture. The burial mound, the large conical burial mound, these are illustrations of the artifacts that Putnam found there. And he didn't know anything about the Adena culture. It hadn't been named at the time he was working, but these artifacts are characteristic of what we would now call the Adena culture that lived there between 800 BCE to 100 CE. Well, I don't say they lived there for that time period, but that's the temporal extent of the Adena culture. And somewhere in there, the Adena occupied that site and constructed this burial mound. They also built the other small burial mound there. But this mound, on the other hand, over across the park road, if you remember that on the map, we would now say that mound had been built by the Fort Ancient culture. And these are some of the diagnostic characteristic points, knives and things, drills that were found in that mound. Also, that habitation area, that area where all the busyness was going on, which included burials and fire pits and houses and so on, it consisted of a large, what we would now call Fort Ancient occupation, and that's illustrated by the artifacts on the top there. And then beneath it, stratigraphically below it, Putnam found evidence of an earlier occupation that was much smaller, whether it was a Adena habitation or a mortuary camp or whatever it was. It was a smaller occupation in that same area. So we've got the Adena and the Hopewell. Who built the mound? Frederick Putnam felt convinced that it was built by the earlier culture. He said everything relating to the construction of the great earthwork points to antiquity. He didn't specify what he meant by everything, but he does seem to have thought the later culture was more closely associated with the indigenous American Indians of the historic period, and he seemed to be unimpressed with their cultural achievements, and so attributed the Serpent to the earlier people who seem to have had grander ideas about civilization. So what about radiocarbon dates? We do now have several radiocarbon dates from the site. What story do they tell? How do they allow us to put Serpent Mound reliably into a time framework? Well, back in 1991, I worked with a team of several people there, you can see their names, on an excavation at Serpent. In reading Putnam's accounts, in many places there was an ashy layer, supposedly, at the base of the mound. And we thought if we could re-excavate one of Putnam's trenches, sample that ashy layer, we could get very reliable radiocarbon dates. It would demonstrate burning that happened at the base of the mound. And so we used coring to find disturbed earth, which marked a trench. We excavated a tiny little narrow slit trench into that and then worked it back. until we came to these undisturbed deposits there. Now the arrow points to that light gray area. That's the original dense, original mound deposit. Everything above that was restoration added by Putnam. And then below it is this Bratton silt loam soil profile, but it's been truncated. There's no A horizon. And Frederick Putnam said that that was characteristic of what he'd found beneath the mound, that there was none of this layer. I'll allude to this again. And I put this here, this profile from the oval showing, so against the profile that we found, showing what's beneath the serpent. And what Putnam described there in this diagram was gray clay. And I think that corresponds pretty closely to what we've got at the base of this 1991 profile that we did. So we took samples. We have found no ash layers, so we couldn't date that, but we went to the most intact layers. Now here, just a little bit, if you see my arrow, this is a area where there was a rodent burrow of some kind through there, probably a groundhog of some sort that disturbed it. But this part of the mound was intact, and this part of the mound was intact. So we took soil samples from that part and from this part, subjected them to flotation, charcoal floated up. We were able to identify the species of wood. I think it was white oak and one other species that I don't remember. And then we used AMS dating to date that, and both samples gave us identical dates of right around 1100 CE, which suggested to us that that meant that the mound was built by the Fort Ancient culture. I mean, there are other ways that particulate charcoal could get embedded into mounds. Perhaps a tree growing on an earlier mound gets struck by lightning and burns up, and then earthworms work that charcoal down. But we have no evidence of that in the soil profile that happened. So our hypothesis is that this is charcoal that was from fires burning in the area where the mound is being constructed, got swept up into the earth that was being dumped on the mound. And so it reliably dates the mound. But we recognize it's not like finding that burned layer at the bottom. So more recently, the results published in 2014, a team of several scholars, archaeologists and others, undertook an effort to date the mound by soil cores. They put a number of soil cores into the mound and then dated what they called the buried A horizon, which was puzzling because Putnam said there was no A horizon. He says specifically that the black soil had been stripped from beneath the serpent, and he excavated around the entire perimeter of the serpent in order to be able to restore it accurately. And we've got one picture of his profile of it on this near the tail, and it clearly shows there's no A horizon. So I think taking Putnam at his word, whatever this other team found beneath the serpent, it was not an A horizon, it was a truncated soil profile. Now, dating a mound with soil cores is a difficult and problematic issue. And this has just come up in a 2019 issue of the Norwegian Archaeological Review. Archaeologists in Denmark were trying to date burial mounds in their area using soil cores. And they got disparate results, and they from what they thought about the mounds, the dates seemed to be way too old. So then they decided to test that hypothesis that the dates from their soil cores were too old. They went to mounds that had already been tested and had been dated by finding charcoal associated with burials and things at the base of the mound. And they took new soil cores in those mounds and dated them, and they also came back too old. So it's not the quote there, but the summary there, that charcoal extracted from soil cores produced dates from between 550 to 700 to as much as 3,000 years older than dates obtained for the same mounds by more reliable methods. So this, to me, suggests all kinds of problems with dating with soil cores. You're not sure what you're dating. The team admits in their first article that they were dating soil organics, not even charcoal that could be identified, which is even more problematic because those soil humates can be contaminated in all kinds of ways. So I think, just based on radiocarbonates, I think the team, and of course I'd think this because I was one of those team members, that the team that got the Fort Ancient dates has the more reliable radiocarbon dates than the team that has these early woodland Adena culture dates. So without balancing the various problematic issues associated with the various ways of radiocarbon dating the mound, what's another way we could date the mound? Even though there's no artifacts in it, the mound itself can be viewed as a kind of artifact. So let's look at the symbolism, the iconography of a gigantic serpent relative to what the Adena culture and the Fort Ancient culture were doing. Which one of them, or did both of them, think serpents were a really amazing thing? Well, as far as Adena serpents go, I can only think of one, and it's problematic. There's a sinuous design on the loincloth of the famous Adena pipe, Ohio's official state artifact that was found in the mound that's shown here, in the Adena mound. And I think it probably is a serpentine design, but that's like the only example I could find. Fort Ancient serpents, there's a lot of them. There's this interwoven guilloche pattern that's often been interpreted as intertwined serpents. On the right there's these beautiful copper serpents that look very much like Serpent Mound, that seem to be related to the Oneata culture in Wisconsin, in that area, because they have some of the same things there. But these were found at the Madisonville site in Ohio. And then there's this slate engraving of a monster kind of fish snake creature with these big giant teeth. And this was from a site not that far from Serpent Mound, actually, down in southern Ohio. Mississippian serpents, so in the broader Mississippian world in which the Fort Ancient were a part in Ohio, has appearing at about this time what's been called the Braden art style. Lots of serpents, but this appears at around AD 850, extends to about 1250. It's characterized by a certain amount of realism, balanced compositions, abundant serpent iconography, and tableau that illustrates episodes from the great cosmic acts of creation. And this is from a summary that Kent Riley published in Recovering Ancient Spiro pretty recently. Mississippian iconography featured especially, according to Susan Power, new serpentine expressions, often distinguished by their unique size, placement, elaboration, and at times function. So this is, I'm sure, review for many people, the Mississippian cosmos, 3 layers, the upper world with the thunderbirds and those spirits, the middle world in which we live and the plant life and animal life of our world, and then the watery lower world, the beneath world, which was the domain of the underwater panther and the great horned serpent. The Berger figurine there from Cahokia shows the spiritual being that's often referred to as the old woman who never dies, or first woman. And she's interacting here with a kind of great serpent, but with those monster-like teeth. She's raking the back of the serpent with a hoe, and the tail is turning into squash vines. And the old woman is in that cosmos. Her abode is in the moon, and that's at the very bottom of Kent Riley's representation there of that 3-layered Mississippian cosmos. Now, Romain et al. Romain is one of the principals of the other view that think the serpent was built by Adena. One of his criticisms of me appealing to things like this imagery, why this imagery is more important, why the fact that there's so much serpent imagery in Mississippian and Fort Ancient and almost none in Adena, Romain et al. Just said that was irrelevant because there are many reasons why people or creatures may or may not be represented in prehistoric imagery. We do not find images of the Buddha, Mohammed, or Jesus made during their lifetimes, but that does not mean that those individuals were not important. And that's absolutely true. But if the Adena had a religious prohibition against creating graven images of serpents, why in the world would they create the largest graven image of a serpent in the world? It seems to be much clearer that Serpent Mound, whoever built it, the people that built it did not have a religious prescription against building graven images of serpents. So going back to McLean's map, and I alluded to why there was some useful insights there in terms of iconography and symbolism. If that represents the authentic original form of Serpent Mound, how can we interpret it? I mean, we can't just make crap up like McLean saying it's a frog jumping away from the serpent striking at it. Well, I didn't think there was a way until I was reading a book. I picked up a book called Picture Cave by a number of authors, including Jim Duncan and Carol Diaz-Granados, who I've since come to collaborate with. And it was a beautiful illustrated cave. These are paintings from the Mississippian period of this lining this cave practically that Carol and Jim think are the creation story, the creation epic of the Degea-Siouan peoples. And when I came to this illustration in the book, three things jumped out at me, and I'll just show you what those three things were. A serpent, a sort of splayed leg, wishbone-shaped being, and then this oval. And I interpreted this, here I've sort of juggled the figures around a little bit, as an alternative image of the same iconography of Serpent Mound. And as it happened, Carol was going to give a talk at the local Denison University here, and I went to the university to hear the talk, and afterwards, Jim was there too. I went up to them and I showed them these printouts, and I said, well, what do you think of this? And they'd never seen McLean's map. And they agreed with me that whatever Serpent Mound represented, it was the same thing that was going on the walls of Picture Cave. And they thought they knew what was going on the walls of Picture Cave from working with both descendants of the Degea-Siouan peoples, but also early ethnographies and early descriptions of that culture. So they think this represents the making of the earthright of the Degea-Sioux, that the being that so many people have interpreted as a frog, or at least McLean did, is first woman, old woman who never dies. And the serpent is the great serpent, lord of the underworld. And the oval in the book, the Picture Cave, it's co-authored, or there are contributions from a number of authors. I think Jim and Carol lean towards the idea that this is the vulva of first woman, exaggerated symbolically. Others think it's the toothy mouth of the great serpent. But in either way, they would call it a pars pro toto, part for the whole, symbolic representation of sort of this event. And the making of the earthright, as written by Alice Fletcher and Francis LaFlèche in 1911, was intended not only to dramatize the myth of creation, but it was believed to ensure the continuance of that which had been created. So this is a moment, this depicts a moment in that making of the earthright when after, and you can read more about this in some of our articles, after the serpent is defeated in a battle, he surrenders, ends up being the adopted husband of first woman and the great serpent mate. And in that mating, first woman acquires the powers of regeneration of the serpent, and she uses those powers to create all life on earth. So this is a very pivotal moment in that creation myth. It's when first woman becomes endowed with the powers of creation. Now this is a different image from Serpent Cave of the great serpent. And you can see he's got antlers, got those really intense eyes there, and he's got these bulges on his neck that Carol and Jim interpret as ear spools. Well, Serpent Mound has these bulges at its neck, and those things have been alternately interpreted as wings, as if it were the feathered serpent, and those wings, could make it fly, or as horns, the horns of the horned serpent. But it occurs to me that those are ear spools, just like are represented in that pictograph. And one of the really interesting things is that pictograph in particular, Picture Cave, has been dated. It's got charcoal in it, and the dates are almost exact. They certainly overlap the dates that we got for the Fort Ancient period dates for Serpent Mound, which is kind of an interesting coincidence or not. This time period, right around 1100, It's about this time, Robert Cook writes about this in a couple of articles and books, of the Mississippian Big Bang. And he says, results clearly show that gene flow did occur between some Mississippian and early Fort Ancient sites, which coincided with droughts in the Mississippi Valley that would be beginning at around AD 1100. I mean, this, and Rob Cook shows this in his drawing, that this Mississippian elements start showing up at a number of sites like Sunwatch Village, and perhaps Serpent Mound. Now, sort of going back, what else is going on, with Serpent Mound that you could compare with what's happening with, and obviously Serpent Mound is an effigy mound. So who else built effigy mounds? The Adena are not known for having built any effigy mounds. They built conical burial mounds, and that's Miamisburg Mound, one of the largest that they built. And they built small, as in maybe 200 feet across, circular earthworks that probably were the equivalent of their community churches. They're sacred spaces where ceremonies took place, but they are small, as if they only served sort of a local community. There are some questionable, problematic, maybe Middle Woodland or Hopewell culture effigy mounds, but you can see that these are somewhat problematic. Eagle Mound at the Newark earthworks could be an arrow, it could be a bird's footprint. It's nothing like Serpent Mound. When you look at Serpent Mound, you know exactly what it is. Most Hopewell mounds, burial mounds, are blobby. And it's because the Hopewell would build a timber structure and perform other little ceremonies like on the sides. And then the mounds would cover where those ceremonial activities had been performed. So the shapes of the mounds conform to the shapes of the activities that took place there. Trimper Mound on the right. Some people have called it an elephant mound or a taper mound and thought it was an effigy mound. It's like, yeah, I don't think so. I think these are like Rorschach tests. They're blobby. And then if you look at the blobs, you can come to all kinds of interpretations about it. The bottom one there is Ontario's Serpent Mound. And it does sort of have this serpentine form, but it's thick. It's got a bunch of Hopewell burials in it, which like Serpent Mound doesn't have that. But it looks more like a slug than a serpent. And some of the most recent scholarship on that has admitted that it's like, well, who knows what that zigzag shape represents, but it is kind of serpentine. So it's got a possible parallel there, but the function seems very different. This is a burial mound, and the design is much less elegant. There are Fort Ancient culture effigy mounds in Ohio. There's the Alligator Mound, which has been very reliably dated, charcoal embedded in the floor of the mound. Kern Effigy 1, and we can argue whether that's really a serpent or not. It doesn't have a serpentine pattern, but it was a long sort of curvilinear limestone mound with a big slab set at the tail that looked a lot like a rattlesnake's tail. There's another effigy, Kern Effigy 2, on the other side of the valley. Kern Effigy 1 was dated to the Fort Ancient culture. And there's a Kentucky Serpent Mound, a Kentucky boulder mound like the Kern Effigy that's also dated to the Fort Ancient culture. And then the effigy mound culture, especially in Wisconsin and neighboring areas, has thousands of effigy mounds that date between 700 and 1100 CE, including some very few serpents, but lots of these underworld spirits, underworld panthers with long tails, sometimes curving in ways that are reminiscent of a snake. And then here's one from Illinois, somewhat closer to Ohio, that's quite reminiscent of Ohio, in that it's got this oval object in the mouth of the serpent. And it may be a much cruder representation of that same story. So all told, you look at these cultural similarities, the effigy mound culture, there at the bottom, that is between about 700 CE and up to like 1100, 1150 CE. Serpent Mound, which dates to around 1100, 1120. Alligator Mound, which is a little bit later. Those all seem to fit together as part of a cultural whole. Effigy Mound culture is a separate culture, indeed, from the Ohio cultures, but there's overlap. To me, this is a compelling argument that all these effigy mounds were built during this time period. If the folks that argue it was Adena are right, you see Serpent Mound on the far left there. It's back there, and so they build the most elegant and amazing effigy mound ever, and nobody ever thinks to build another one for more than 1,000 years. That is not a compelling argument to me in terms of the cultural context of these mounds. Where do the ideas for making a gigantic serpent mound come from? It seems more interesting to me to think that, and more compelling, that they come from this surrounding cultural context and were introduced into Ohio by Mississippians and perhaps by the effigy mound culture as well. Now, when I've suggested that, Romain and Herman, in one of the back and forth replies that we've had, said that my use of the effigy mound culture to bolster the Fort Ancient Association for Serpent Mound is reminiscent of the arguments employed by ancient alien theorists. Well, that's a bit harsh, although, yeah, I did appear on an episode of Ancient Aliens once talking about Serpent Mound, much to my shame. But in fairness, we were told that as the Ohio History Connections media department, we were told that I would be the voice of reason, the voice of science in the program, and then it would be opposed to their alternative interpretations. And they sent a cameraman down to Serpent Mound, and they probably interviewed me for 3 hours. And I explained how this was absolutely ridiculous to think that ancient astronauts built Serpent Mound, that it was clearly a work of ancient indigenous American Indian landscape art built with baskets and clamshell hose, and we have the cultural context all around it. None of that shows up in the show. I'm on for about 10 seconds saying how wonderful Serpent Mound is, and then they cut on to other things later saying, oh yes, and it was built by aliens. So it looks as if I'm championing that idea, or at least supportive of it, when in fact, I'm not, obviously. So maybe they could get the idea that I had something to do with ancient aliens, but if they did, that's pretty unfair too. But really, I much prefer the work of Steve Lexon and others that say people were aware of what was going on over the hill and over the horizon. People in Ohio knew about those effigy mounds, either from person to person, village to village interaction, hearing stories, or people traveling and seeing, wow, this is really cool what you guys are doing up here, and then going home and, let's do this here. They're far apart, certainly, but the preceding Hopewell culture was that we're interacting with people up in the Rocky Mountains in the Gulf of Mexico. So why is it so extraordinary to propose that Ohio's people in Southern Ohio, the Fort Ancient culture, was interacting with, in some ways, the people up in Wisconsin, when we know the late Fort Ancient people were making the same kinds of copper effigies like the Oneota culture were making. So it doesn't seem to me to be that much of a stretch. So here's the diagram that Ernie Bojart created for the article that Carol and Jim and I did for the North American Archaeologist, showing these different areas: the Effigy Mound area in the north, the blue area is the Fort Ancient region, the red area is Mississippian, and then Robert Cook talks about these droughts in the Mississippi Valley pushing people out into Ohio, where we have villages, the Sunwatch Village, for example, with definite Mississippian components. Actually, what I guess I wanted to say before that was, with regard to this argument on effigy mounds, Jim, Carol, and I had Ernie Bojart reach out to us. He's one of the experts of effigy mound culture in Wisconsin. That's where he works. He reached out to us and said, I've got this Willow Drive Mound group. I read your article, and I think it's sort of the same thing that you've got, this horseshoe-shaped mound and a conical mound at the head of a serpentine mound. And in this case, there was a bird on the end of it too. And he shared that with us, and he said, I think this is like what you guys are talking about. And Carol and Jim and I agreed that this is telling a very closely related story, which makes a compelling connection with the iconography of Serpent Mound, the specific, particular iconography of Serpent Mound, and its interpretation with American Indian traditions with these mounds in Wisconsin. So there you've got my fudged version of picture cave pictograph with Willow Drive Mound, with the Great Serpent Mound of Ohio, and some of the same iconographic elements, in different orders, but they're there. So this is kind of what we think must have happened, that there was the effigy mound culture with these tableaux, with storytelling through mounds. At the same time, the Mississippian art style comes about in the Mississippian area, and they have this abundance of serpent iconography. But then there's this drought after AD 1100 pushing people into Ohio. And this is the time when the Fort Ancient culture is there, experiencing these influences from these various areas, serpent iconography, telling stories with effigy mounds. It makes sense to me that that's cultural context out of which Serpent Mound emerges. And even if we look into the contact period, there are perhaps echoes of this in the descendants of the Fort Ancient culture. For example, the Shawnee, if they're the descendants, they're one of the only Eastern Woodlands tribes that has a female creator, and they have a snake clan. And I think it's like one of the only Algonquian tribes to have a snake clan, perhaps the only Algonquian tribe. The Wyandot or Iroquoian group, they have a snake clan, but that's relatively common in Iroquoian groups. But they have stories of women mating with serpents they're interesting outgrowths, perhaps, of these origin myths of perhaps their ancestors. And as a sort of conclusion, the Shawnee tribe, one of the three Shawnee tribes, came to Serpent Mound this past year for the summer solstice. The head of Serpent Mound is aligned to the sunset on the summer solstice. And we've had celebrations of that at various points in the past. But this time we wanted to have it not be sort of a celebration we imposed. We wanted to give that event to the indigenous tribes of Eastern North America. And we reached out to the Shawnee tribe. Chief Glenna Wallace from the Eastern Shawnee was also there. And this is one of the things that Chief Ben Barnes said when he was there. Serpent Mound was purposely built for a special sacred purpose. I should think that anyone that views the serpent will realize its sacredness and treat this place as they would any cathedral, synagogue, or mosque. When we see this place, this is our holy ground. Particularly if Serpent Mound belongs to the Adena culture or belongs to the Fort Ancient culture, there's probably a strong connection with the Shawnee, but also other tribes as well, Miami, perhaps the Wyandot, other tribes that have these echoes of those traditions that Carol and Jim and Ernie and I think are part of the legacy of Serpent Mound, the Effigy Mound culture, and the Mississippian artists of Picture Cave. So went through that pretty fast. For further reading here, these are open access articles. I didn't put like all the articles you could possibly read here, but these are two open access articles that are on the Journal of Ohio Archaeology for the first one, the Mississippian Iconography of Serpent Mound, where I summarize a lot of this and more. And then that why bulk sediment dates on Serpent Mound are problematic is basically just a review of that research from Denmark with some other notes about the problematic nature of soil humate states in general. It's widely recognized to be an unreliable way to date anything. So with that, I'm happy to answer questions. Presumably there are some in the chat. I see there's quite a large number in the chat. So Jim, if you want to go ahead with the questions, let's get started.
Can you hear me? Yeah.
I can. I may have to turn my volume up a little, but yes.
All right. Well, Phil has been doing a great job answering everybody's questions as going along.
Thanks, Phil. You saved me some trouble here.
Let me try to get back up to the top of my.
Okay. Maybe I should stop sharing now so we can see each other.
So a question I had was probably not true, but I saw on Putnam's map that you showed.
Yeah.
Down by the road there were some sulfur springs. Are they still there today?
There are springs there. I don't know about them being sulfur springs.
The map said sulfur, so I don't know.
Okay, I should have paid more attention to the map.
That would be a reason why they were just in the general area if there was springs and fresh water. I mean,
Yeah,
besides, you know,
yeah,
uh,
and effigy mounds in general in Wisconsin often have that association with streams. They're often on bluffs overlooking streams. So it's and the streams are representative of the underworld, the watery underworld. So it seems logical that these underworld spirits would have that association.
all right. And just in general, if the alligator mound doesn't look like an alligator, especially with that curly tail, alligators don't do that. What do you think it is? Phil mentioned the underwater panther.
Yeah, Todd Frolking, one of the other colleagues that I've worked with, he and I wrote a paper for the Cambridge Archaeological Journal on the alligator. We got the dates that dated that to the Fort Ancient period, and yeah, one of the themes of that article is that we definitely think it's an underwater panther. It
Oh,
doesn't look anything like an alligator. It's got that small round head and a curling tail, and we put this in a footnote because it's speculation, but we suggest that if and certainly we know Europeans interacted with American Indians in the area of that mound. And if the Europeans had asked the Indians, the Native Americans, what that mound represented, and they said, let's see, I know the Ojibwe word, Mishipeshu, so underwater panther, that's what they'd said. And the colonists are struggling with the language. And they're going, underwater panther, but panthers don't live in the water. What do you mean? And if the people had said, well, that creature with big teeth that lives in the water and sometimes eats people, they'd say, oh, you mean an alligator. And Ephraim Squire and Edwin Davis, who published that map, write that, yeah, it doesn't look anything like an alligator, but that's what the people say it is, and you can't get them away from it.
right.
Well, if they had been told or thought they'd been told by the indigenous people there that that's what the mound was, then they could be confident that we know what it is because that's what the Native Americans told us it was.
And what is the legend, or what is the cultural heritage of the underwater panther? I mean,
It's widespread in Eastern North America. Some tribes think the underwater panther was the ruler of the underworld. Some think it was the great serpent. Others think they're both. Some think that's the same being, shape-shifting. So it's impossible to know what the builders of the mound thought. But we do know that there are historic tribes in Eastern North America, that thought both the underwater panther and the great serpent were rulers of the underworld. Some give more emphasis to one of them than the other, and some think they're the same creature in different manifestations, the same being. I shouldn't say creature.
it'd be interesting to see if some of the depictions, like I know with the Maya, there's uh, a ball cord in the sky. There's different things that are on the earth are reflections of what's in the sky. It'd be interesting if there was any kind of constellation that the Shawnee saw, or their earlier ancestors saw in the stars above, any of these animal shapes, or any of these power creatures, or did they have above world? Like in the Maya, the underworld was also the nighttime sky.
Yeah, yeah, that's true for the indigenous peoples of North America too.
Yeah. So I
Well,
wonder.
the George Langford and Kent Riley, I think, both written that serpent, the great serpent, is Scorpius in the sky. Also, there are traditions that the Milky Way is the great serpent in the nighttime sky, and in the daytime sky, the great serpent is the rainbow.
Yeah. And that's interesting because we're right, we're in the same uh, decades around the alignment, but with the December solstice sun in December 21st on in 2012, I did a whole program where if you're looking towards the center of the galaxy, there's the Serpent Mound, and the sun slowly takes and we're still in the area of alignment, but
Yeah,
it's Serpent's Mouth that the sun came up to, which is almost like the Serpent Mound with the egg in it.
That's very interesting.
Hmm. And
I'd like
then
to see more about that.
Monet and Phil were going back and forth about the time periods, and they worked out that the Andean was a lot earlier than the Hopewell. And then you pointed that out a lot at towards the end of your program. Um, the Andean was 1,000 to 100 BCE. But now you, in the latter part of your program, you're placing the earthworks in the previous millennium, not or after
Nope.
one.
Yeah. I'm arguing that all these effigy mounds are being built around 1100. In Wisconsin, they start much earlier. They start about 700 CE. So that's clearly where effigy mound building begins and blossoms and flowers. And then they have thousands of them in Wisconsin. We've got 2 in Ohio, maybe 4 if you count those stone effigies. But they are particularly the serpent. It's an extraordinary thing. So it's as if they take advantage of all this synthesis of Mississippian symbolism and the idea of building effigy mounds and fuse it and create this extraordinary landscape art that is Serpent Mound.
So then you showed the one picture of the one mound with corn growing, and Phil answered it a little bit here, but I'm interested in it as corn came up through the Mississippi and all up to the Ohio, everywhere, and mound building. That even I've heard that the earliest mounds are small conical mounds around the mouth of the Mississippi, and then it all spread up. But when did corn get to that area?
Yeah, corn doesn't show up in Ohio until the late woodland. And then particularly with like Fort Ancient, it becomes a staple, a predominant crop. And it feeds these much larger communities. People have said they thought they found Hopewell corn before, but just recently that's all been like AMS dated. And it's like, nope, it's not. That's either intrusive or it's been misidentified. There's all the things that have been attributed to Hopewell corn have been completely refuted.
And my one other comment I had was that the serpent disc that you showed and one other image, the Mississippian Cosmos diagram, the serpents depicted are showing their rattlesnake rattles.
Mm-hmm.
Definitely. And that's one of the 3 important power symbols of the Maya was the coralus rattlesnake. And the jaguar, the rattlesnake, even the shark were all show up in the iconography, in royalties' names, even because they could harm man. So what they were truly, mankind against nature, is what could harm man was showing up more predominantly in their artwork, in their depictions or something like that. So it's interesting that they call everything a serpent when it's definitely a rattlesnake, you know. But someone was saying, Monet was saying that the oval reminds her of a swamp. But somewhere along the line, somebody mentioned ear spools, but I don't see where ear spools came into the picture in the beginning.
Well, there were, when I compared it with that picture of the serpent, or the pictograph that showed the antlers with ear spools. So I think those bulges at the neck of Serpent Mound represent ear spools based on this comparison.
Yeah, I get you. That's interesting. So they're ear spools and not horns or ears.
Yeah, because people have always wondered what those bulges at the neck were. Some people don't even put it on their map because it doesn't seem to make sense to them. Some people make up things like, oh, feathered serpents. So it could be these tiny little wings or horns, and they're not in the right position to be any of those things. They're in a perfect position to be ear spools.
And I mean, the Maya were real big into that. But do you find ear spools in archaeological context?
Yeah, but interestingly enough, not very much in Fort Ancient. They show up a lot in they show up a little bit in Adena. The Adena man has these kind of ear spools, but predominantly those are I suppose, a Hopewell trait. So it's evoking something from the past if it represents a Fort Ancient mound. Although the Mississippians, they had ear spools. So
Wow. And let's see.
Can I say something, Jim?
Sure, go ahead.
That was a great lecture, Brad, and I've seen your talk on this many, many times. But what I found compelling was the Willow Mound group, which I hadn't seen before, along with Picture Cave. They provide really good evidence, I think, to place the iconographic content for Serpent Mound's interpretation. I think that really puts that whole story together in a nice nutshell. The other thing you might want to mention to the people here, the possible astronomical alignment on summer solstice. Yeah, right, summer solstice, I think.
yeah, I guess I alluded to that at the very end, that the serpent head is lined up where the sun sets on the summer solstice. And some people have tried to say that the three main curves of the body are lined up to the summer solstice sunrise, the equinox sunrise, and the winter solstice sunrise. But a problem with that is another group of people say, no, it's lined up to the northernmost rise of the moon, the midpoint in the moonrise, and the southernmost moonrise point. Well, they can't both be right. So that's just an illustration of the sight lines with those curves of the body are so short, you can't reliably get an azimuth to determine it. But given the head's alignment, that would sort of suggest that the curves may also incorporate those other solar alignments too.
So David and Elise are wondering, they say they're very interested in connections between the Ohio cultures and the Southwest cultures. And do you, what types of connections do you see? And do you have any references where they can read more about this, please?
Well, the problem is there really aren't any connections that we can see in the archaeological record other than corn. And corn shows up, in the Ohio Valley. Ultimately, it's from Mesoamerica, and it probably, came through the Southwest. Maybe it came through the Southeast. I'm not sure about that. But people have been looking for those kinds of connections for ages. But in spite of the Hopewell culture, its interaction sphere, no turquoise ever shows up in a Hopewell mound. We have obsidian, and people thought it might be Mexican, maybe New Mexican obsidian, but the chemical fingerprint says it comes from Yellowstone Park and a nearby site in Idaho, Bear Gulch. So none of the obsidian in Ohio's mounds relates to the Southwest. So there's we don't have any parrot bones or things that were found at Cahokia that would make a connection with that. So no, in spite of looking for a couple hundred years, archaeologists have not found the smoking gun that would demonstrate a connection with the Southwest, though I would follow Steve Lexon's lead that they knew each other, they knew about what each other was doing, but for some reason, they didn't get together about it.
And Monet says tons of copper ear spools were found in Ohio.
Yeah, and the copper is always traced to either the copper in Ontario or the copper in the southeastern United States. So the idea of ear spools may have come there, but the stuff it's made of is Eastern North American.
All right. And Dave's saying, you mentioned it may be Sioux. Can we tell the difference between Sioux and Algonquin in the Fort Ancient period?
I would say no. And in the published stuff we've done, we were more candid about it because the Daguiasoan they have the sort of the best recorded beliefs. And so that's what Jim Duncan and Carol Diaz-Granados are working with. These very rich ethnographies and historical accounts of the beliefs of the Daguian Siouan. But I mean, that's what I tried to sort of suggest at the end, that by talking about the Shawnee and Wyandot traditions, that those same stories may have been part of their religious beliefs then as well. But, you know, because of the accidents of history, those Iroquoian or those Algonquian traditions simply aren't preserved sufficiently to be able to make that connection. It's the Digian stories that may be only related to, but may not, they may not be Digian Sioux stories that the Serpent Mound is telling. On the other hand, they may well be, because there was a definite Digian presence in the Ohio Valley. And if sort of we're right that Mississippian influence is coming from the Digian Sioux area, Cahokia, then those ideas may be coming straight out of what are sort of the legacy, the heritage of the Digian Sioux, and that those other stories sort of are reflections of that, the stories from the other tribes. But I don't think we can know. I don't think we know the answer yet, because, you know, from the archaeological record, we can't say the Fort Ancient people were Siouan, or were they Algonquian, or were they Iroquoian? Who knows?
Yeah. So if you were to visit Serpent Mound today, could you walk up in the mound and walk the whole length of it, or they don't let you walk on the mound?
We don't want you to walk on the mound, absolutely. But it has a paved path all the way around it, which is good and bad. I mean, it's good because it allows, you know, large numbers of people to walk around the earthwork, the effigy, and experience it visually and viscerally. But what's bad about it is the path. Putnam didn't think much of the ear spools, what I'm calling ear spools. So the path cuts the ear spools off. And, you know, so there's these bulges on either side of the path that you walk by, that if you don't know this broader tradition, you won't even think they're part of the mound. Huh. And then also Putnam did not restore that wishbone-shaped mound that I think my colleagues and I think his first woman, Putnam didn't restore that. Right now, it's just sort of a wedge. And this was another interesting thing, because Bill Romaine in an article said that there's no evidence of those legs that were coming around the oval. Well, and he was using LIDAR, modern LIDAR, to see there's clearly no